A concept that's related to the carbon footprint is our ecological footprint. Our ecological footprint is an estimate of how much land and water it takes to provide us the things that we need and absorb the waste that we produce. So ecological footprint. This ties in with carbon emissions. The waste that we generate, that includes carbon emissions. So this is a related concept, but it's not the same thing. Okay, so ecological footprint, depending on how we live, this will either increase or decrease our ecological footprint. And there's a graph here showing different countries. I do want to note this graph is out of date. I don't think that these are accurate representations of current day ecological footprints, but the graph still sort of gets the idea across. So some countries produce more waste and use more resources, so they have a higher ecological footprint than others. And if we take the average of all of them, we could sort of think about the world average, and that world average will help us to figure out how many people can the Earth sustain long term. So on that note, we're going to switch gears a little bit. This is essentially moving into chapter 19 material. We're going to talk about population ecology now. Population ecology is all about changes in populations. So population size and factors that regulate those population sizes over time. A few examples of applications from this field. So how is this a useful thing to study? Things like being able to conserve endangered species, save endangered species. This is a direct outcome from population ecology. Having done studies of population ecology, maybe we can save endangered species. Sustainable resource management, so managing our resources, again, in that sustainable way, a way that allows future generations to meet their needs as well. Invasive species control. If there's an invasive species, how do we get rid of it? Well, understanding population ecology will let us do that. Related idea, controlling pests, biological control of pests. Biological control as opposed to chemical control. What this is all about is understanding, so if we can understand what the natural enemy is of some pest, then maybe just releasing that natural enemy into this habitat where the pest is at, maybe that'll be sufficient to get rid of the pest. So that's a biological control. And related to that is integrated pest management. Integrated pest management uses many different approaches. It's a combination approach. It uses biological control, chemical control, and also cultural control methods for sustainably controlling pest populations and keeping them at low enough levels that we can all go on with our lives. So when we're talking about populations, how do we describe a population? There are a few different ways. We can talk about the size of the population, which is just literally describing how many individuals there are in a given population. Remember, population is talking about individuals of the same species. Okay, so how many of this particular species are living in an area? We could instead talk about the density, so consider the space that these organisms have available to them. Number of individuals per area would be the density of a population. And then another way to describe the population is by its age structure. And I'm showing a graph here. These are called age structure diagrams. They're extremely useful for seeing the history of a population and also making predictions about future changes to that population. Let's just take a look here at this one. So age structure diagrams, they break down a lot of information. Generally, they have males represented on one side and females represented on the other side. And what we can see on this axis are different age groupings. So down here are the young individuals, up here are the old individuals. And if we look at this population, we can see there are a lot of young individuals compared to how many old people there are. So based on that, we would predict that many years later, if we come back and look at the same population, there are going to be a lot of people that have moved into middle age, right? And then if we go forward again, okay, those individuals will have shifted up into perhaps old age. So looking at a single snapshot in time, just based on the distribution of this age structure diagram, is it a pyramid or is it an inverted pyramid? That's going to give us an indication of whether this population is likely to grow or to shrink over time. so it allows us to make predictions. Survivorship curves show the likelihood that individuals in a given population will survive to a given age. And there are 3 different characteristic survivorship curves. They are all 3 shown on this same graph. Survivorship curves, let's take a look at type 1 here. This is characteristic of organisms like people. Okay, so people, let's see here, we're looking at lifespan, percent of maximum lifespan on this axis, and then how many individuals are surviving on this axis. Okay, so let's just consider in the human population we have a certain number of people who are born, and initially 100% or nearly 100% are surviving. And we have good health care here. Most of us survive through childhood and into adulthood, and then we start to die off as we approach old age. Generally, that's what happens in human populations. So this graph, it stays straight for a while, and then it curves off, and the percentage of survivors on this axis, eventually it goes to 0. That's a type 1 survivorship curve. A type 3 survivorship curve, let's look at this one. So initially, okay, individuals are produced, but a lot of them die off right from the get-go. So not very many individuals are surviving to old age. This is true for a lot of marine organisms. A lot of fish produce tons and tons of eggs, but then a lot of those eggs get eaten. Not very many of them actually hatch and make it into adulthood. So that's a type 3 survivorship curve. Right down the middle here, we have a type 2 survivorship curve. And this is essentially, it's right in between 1 and 3. So this is kind of a constant survivorship. A few individuals die early on, and they just kind of consistently get picked off until they all die in old age. So that's a type 2 survivorship curve. When we're trying to predict population growth, one of the key things that comes up is resource availability. If a population has unlimited resources, it will grow, and it will grow pretty much without bound. A great example of this is if you've got some rabbits and they're in a very nice huge meadow, they're going to be reproducing quickly, and they're going to exhibit what's called exponential growth. Exponential population growth, like this, it goes up like an exponential graph. Exponential population growth happens if resources are unlimited. That's the very key sort of criteria here. The other type of population growth that we might see is what happens if resources are limited. If there are resource limitations, for example, if you have, I don't know, maybe a population that lives on an island, for example, then initially, if you introduce just a couple of individuals to that island, initially they'll be able to grow and reproduce, but eventually they perhaps start to be limited by food availability. So then their growth curve is going to just level off, and this is called logistic growth. So it starts off like exponential growth, but then it curves over. That's very characteristic of logistic growth. There are also populations that will cycle. So they'll grow for a while and then they'll decline for a while. Population cycles happen a lot of times with a lot of times you might have 2 populations that cycle, and their cycles are synchronized in some way. So the example here is predator and prey. And if you take a look at this, so the hare is the prey and the lynx is the predator. And as one of those populations, as the hare population increases, that allows the lynx population to increase as well because they have a good food supply. Once there are quite a few lynx, though, they start eating the hares, so the hare population declines, and subsequently the lynx population declines because they don't have food anymore. So we get these oscillations that take place. Population cycles are very interesting to study. They happen in insect populations as well. So that's a sort of a variant on different sorts of growth that we might observe in populations.